about what trauma is, recognizing a lot of the traumas in our community, trauma responses, signs and symptoms, where to find resources, and when there's a crisis. And then I'm going to come back in the room and I'm going to talk about what resiliency is and how we begin to build resiliency skills.
It always show out. It always show out when you're trying to do something.
I know, and I did it. I did it. And
Can you please? Thank you.
Yeah, you might want to just do like an overall mute of everybody. I think you can do that. So I want to ask you to just think for yourself how you define trauma, right? If I said to you, give me a definition of trauma, how do you define that? What does trauma look like? What does trauma feel like? What are some things that are traumatic, right? Because often we live in a state of trauma and don't recognize it, because unfortunately, a lot of times in our communities, trauma is literally normalized. It is experiences that we have that we begin to expect and think that that's the way the world operates. So whatever or however you define trauma, trauma is actually defined as the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of hopelessness, diminishes your sense of self, and your ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. And trauma is subjective because what is traumatic to one person might not be traumatic to the next person. And the way one person responds to a trauma might be different from the way another person responds to trauma. So no one gets to tell you whether or not you're traumatized. You determine whether or not an experience or a circumstance or a situation has traumatized you. I want to talk about big T traumas and little t traumas because there are types of traumas that we experience, again, that we might not recognize. So large T traumas are extraordinary events that bring about severe distress and helplessness. They may be one-time events like acts of terrorism, a natural catastrophe, a sexual assault, or they may be prolonged stressors like war or abuse or neglect or violence, right? So a big T trauma is every single time someone dies by gunfire in our communities. That's a big T trauma. A big T trauma is every time we witness police brutality, not only in our communities, but across the news and social media. Those are big T traumas. If you've been a victim of a sexual assault or any other type of violence, that is a big T trauma. But often people don't recognize things like prolonged generational poverty is also a trauma. Substance use disorder is a trauma. If you've been living with active addiction, that is a trauma to you physically and emotionally, right? Then we have small T traumas, which are circumstances where one's bodily safety or life may not necessarily be threatened, but cause symptoms of trauma nonetheless. These events set one off kilter and disrupt our normal functioning in the world. Examples include like losing a job or moving or relationships ending, like divorce, infidelities, or upsetting personal conflicts, life stressors like financial troubles, work stress, conflicts, or legal battles. Those are what we call smaller T traumas. We also, as communities of color, suffer smaller T traumas in microaggressions, the way the world engages with us and the way we engage with the world based on our skin color and the adversities that we had that come out of systemic racism. There are often small T traumas in that as well. But I think it's important to recognize that these traumas, whether they're big or small, have real adverse experiences in our communities that we may not necessarily recognize and that often people don't acknowledge for our urban communities, right? So adverse childhood experiences are traumatic events that can have negative lasting effects on health and well-being. And the three major areas are household challenges, abuse, and neglect. So I'm going to read this chart to you, and I want you to just think to yourself how many of these situations you recognize in your life, in your home, in your community, in your neighborhood. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about what ACEs looks like. So if you think about household challenges like domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation, divorce, having an incarcerated parent, or abuse, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect, whether it's emotional neglect or physical neglect. So there is a test called ACEs, and there's 10 questions, and those 10 questions are based on these 3 areas. And it asks whether or not you as a child experienced any one of these 10 adverse experiences. And I stumbled into this test at a conference not that long ago, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, where someone handed me the test in a training and said, here, answer these 10 questions. And out of those 10 questions, I had 9 affirmative answers. I had experienced 9 of those adverse childhood traumas. The only trauma that I did not have on the list was an incarcerated parent. In addition to that, I had several other traumas that weren't on the list, that had not been acknowledged as traumas. And so people who live with adverse childhood experiences, if they have 6 or more ACEs, can die up to 20 years earlier. 1/8 of the population have more than 4 ACEs. 67% of the population have at least 1 ACE. Those who live with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are often 3 times the level of lung disease and adult smoking, 14 times the number of suicide attempts, 4.5 times more likely to develop depression, 2 times the level of liver disease due to alcoholism, 4 times as likely to have begun intercourse by age 15, and 11 times the level of intravenous drug use. If you look at the pyramid of lifespan at the bottom right, you'll see that those who suffer from adverse childhood experiences often grow into disrupted neural development, the way we think and engage with the world, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, diseases, disabilities, social problems, and often early death from very preventable diseases. So why am I telling you this? Because it's important to recognize what traumas are. Many of us have suffered from these traumas as children and don't even know it, have not even recognized it, have thought that this was normal. And so I'm giving you permission to recognize a lot of the traumas that you may have experienced, that I indeed experienced, right? And realize one really important thing. When you are suffering from a mental illness, if you are living with a substance use disorder, it is not what is wrong with you, it is what has happened to you. And normally what happens to you is going to play out in the form of an addiction and a mental health challenge. So if you look a little deeper into a lot of the ACEs or adverse childhood experiences that we have in our communities, we realize that when these experiences are left unaddressed, toxic stress from adverse childhood experiences harms our children and our families, our organizations, our systems, and our communities, and it reduces the ability of individuals and entities to respond to stressful events with resiliency. The ACEs in these 3 areas intertwine in people's lives and affect organizations, systems, and communities. So what this means is when you have whole communities, whole families, whole neighborhoods that are affected by trauma, it literally shifts the generation of those in the community, and we find ourselves in a vicious cycle from one generation to the next. And I think it's important to address everything that's going on in the household, whether it's maternal depression or bullying or domestic violence or emotional and sexual abuse or alcoholism or physical and emotional neglect or divorce or an incarcerated family member or whether there are environmental issues like subpar housing and mold and lead in water and toxins in the ground, and all of the other environmental injustices that happen in our poor marginalized communities, a lot of that is born of number 2 at the bottom where it says community. The roots of a lot of these adverse experiences has to do with historical traumas from enslavement of Black African American communities, lack of social capital and mobility because of generations of redlining, substandard schools because of subpar income, structural racism, poor water and air quality, and a host of other environmental injustices, violence, which we know is born out of oppression, poverty, substandard wages, lack of jobs, and poor housing quality and affordability, not to mention subpar education systems. All of these adversities in communities develops into adverse childhood experiences, and a lot of it becomes trauma response behaviors that often aren't recognized. And when they're not recognized and they're not treated, then we begin to behave in ways that are born into substance use disorder and mental illness. One of the things that I think is really important is that often our youth are traumatized for a whole host of reasons. Now, that's not to say that our youth aren't resilient, because they are indeed, right? If our youth were not resilient, then our populations would have died out decades ago, right? Centuries ago. But our children still suffer from traumas, and a lot of the behaviors that are born out of trauma, we often don't recognize as mental health challenges. We think that they are behavior problems. We think that they are disruptive problems. We think that they are acting out problems. And a lot of times we criminalize our Black and brown children because of very natural responses to traumas that they've had. And children who are criminalized and adultified because of their traumas grow up to be traumatized adults. So a lot of the behaviors around trauma is becoming sexually active early, feeling sense of guilt and shame, early substance use disorder, early eating disorders, which Black and brown youth do have, taking risky behaviors, feeling different from others, isolating, as well as having issues around health and sleep. And it's really, really important to understand that often we don't see these behaviors as red flags. We ignore them, we rationalize them, we justify them, not because we don't care, but because often we don't recognize trauma for what it is. So I want to talk about signs of trauma in adults. Right? A lot of this we see in youth as well, but in adults, regardless of what that trauma is, whether it's been a car accident or the sudden loss of a job and a plunge into poverty, if it is a sudden global pandemic where your livelihood has been uprooted and your sense of normalcy has been decimated, whether it is grief from loss of normalcy or grief from loss of a loved one, regardless of what that trauma is, some of the signs and symptoms that you're going to see is prolonged sadness or unexplained crying spells, significant changes in appetite and sleep patterns, irritability, anger, worry, agitation, anxiety, pessimism, indifference, loss of energy, persistent lethargy, persistent violent behavior. Let me share with you that this country does not like to see angry Black and brown people. And so when we see irritability, anger, agitation, anxiety, or even violent behavior that might be minimal, we immediately criminalize and incarcerate Black and brown people who might actually be suffering from a mental illness. Other signs of trauma, feelings of guilt and worthlessness, inability to concentrate, indecisiveness, inability to take pleasure in activities and interests, social withdrawal from family, friends, and events, unexplained aches and pains, recurring thoughts of death and suicide. So let me share a story. I had a church member call me. This was some years ago. And she said, you know, you talk about mental health all the time, and I really want to talk to you about my son. He's an adult. He's in his early 30s. And he just won't do anything. He won't get out of bed. He won't help me with chores. He won't get a job. He barely takes a shower. And I'm so angry at him because he's not being responsible. And I think something's wrong. And so I said, well, let me ask you some questions. I said, is your son a vet? Has he ever been in the military? She said, yes, he was in the Iraq War. I said, and since he came back from the Iraq War, has he had any experiences that have been violent? She said, yes, he was mugged one time. They jumped him as he was walking back from the store and they slit his throat. And I said to her, your son is not lazy. Your son is traumatized. He's living in a state of post-traumatic stress disorder. Your son doesn't need judgment. What your son needs is help. He needs therapy. He needs counseling. He needs a safe space to heal. He needs a professional that's going to help him work through the traumas that he's experiencing. She said, well, he walks the floor all night. I said, because he's probably having nightmares, because he's probably ruminating and reliving these traumas over and over again. But if we don't recognize the behaviors of what trauma looks like, then we don't know that our loved ones are suffering from trauma. So it's important to recognize what trauma is before we can start to advocate for ourselves and our loved ones. And it's important to understand, again, this is not what's wrong with you. This is what has happened to you. So what do you do now, right? Because I being a middle-aged Black woman, completely understand what it means to be strong. I understand what it means not to be vulnerable. I understand what it means not to show a crack in my armor. I also know what it means to be in so much pain that I have to use alcohol to numb my emotions. So I'm here today to tell you that there is a better way. And I want to make sure that you understand again that the traumas are not what's wrong with you. The traumas are not because you're weak. The traumas are not because you have a character defect. It's not because you did something incorrect. It's not because you've been cursed. It's because of what you have experienced. And once you embrace that and realize that this is not a personal judgment on you, but it's about empowering you to wrap your arms around your wellness, then we can begin to move forward and recognize that you deserve all things good. And you have the power to advocate for yourself and your loved ones. So what do you do now that you understand it, right? Well, this is one of my favorite quotes. You can fall, but you can also rise. You can fall, but you can also rise. And I know what it's like to be so depressed that I can't get out of bed. I know what it's like to not take a shower for days on end. I know what it's like not to eat, but to continually drink. I know what it's like not to be sober for literally weeks at a time. I know what it's like to lose a job and not have any money. I know what it's like to have flashbacks because of traumas that I've experienced. And I know what it's like to lose someone and be so deep in grief that you're not sure how you're going to get through the next day. But I'm giving you permission to tell you that trauma does not mean that you can't rise again. You do that by empowering yourself. Because one thing I deeply believe is that people are not interested in being saved. People are interested in being empowered. And the way you empower yourself and each other is with knowledge and information. Self-advocacy is the key. Now, I shared this just an hour ago in another session that I did, is that often we don't understand what self-advocacy is. Again, not because there's anything wrong with us, but because we haven't really had anybody model for us what self-advocacy means, right? Self-advocacy is the ability to articulate our needs and make informed decisions about the supports necessary to meet these needs. So if no one has shared with you information around what trauma is, if no one has explained to you what mental illness is, then you therefore don't have the vocabulary to actually advocate for yourself and explain what's wrong, right? When I take my Buick to the shop and they say, well, what's wrong with the car, Kimmy? I don't have the language to tell them what's wrong because I know nothing about what goes on under that hood, right? So I can tell them, well, it's making this funny noise. And well, you know, every once in a while I get this strange smell. And when I put my foot on the gas, it does this, right? I can't really advocate what's wrong with this car because I know nothing about what happens underneath the hood. Well, it's the same thing with mental illness. If you don't understand what mental illness is, if you don't understand what trauma is, it's hard to advocate. It's hard to say, this is what I'm struggling with. This is what my loved one is struggling with. So the first key to self-advocacy is understanding what it is that you're dealing with so that you can articulate, you can voice what your challenges are. And I'm giving you permission to make your self-advocacy a priority. Now, I'm not giving you permission because I'm anything special, far from it. But when I give people permission, what I'm saying is, if you look like me, walk like me, talk like me, and you see that I've learned how to live in recovery and embrace my wellness, then it means you can too. And it means that you deserve all things good, just like I do. So some of the keys to recovery around traumas and around mental illnesses like depression and anxiety and borderline and bipolar have to do with counseling and therapy. And I get, you know, we don't go and talk to professionals. We don't talk to people that don't look like us. We're not sure that we want to sit in front of a therapist, right? But we're in a position today where we can do our homework. I know that therapists and counselors of color are unicorns, but they are out there. And I have a list of resources. And these are therapists that understand Black and Brown communities, that recognize our culture, and that know how to engage with us and teach us life-affirming wellness strategies, coping skills. So counseling and therapy is always an option. And then you have really homeopathic options as well around exercise and physical activity. When we move our bodies, whether it's in dance or walking or running or swimming or tennis or anything else, any physical activity that we enjoy, it sends off endorphins in our brains that make us feel good. And I know that if you're struggling with depression and anxiety, exercise is often the last thing you want to do. But if you feel safe enough, then take a walk around the block, go to the park and walk. Go on YouTube and find some exercise videos, but get your body moving so that your brain and your heart starts pumping out those hormones. Holistic strategies like yoga, Tai Chi, mindfulness, meditation, nutrition. I teach an entire course on mindfulness and meditation. And what that does is it teaches you how to train your brain to worry less and focus in the moment. And these are also forms of physical activity, right? Nutrition is key. We want to make sure that we are eliminating as much sugar and caffeine as we can, that we are eating as healthy as possible, because our brains are an organ like any other organ. And so we need our brains to be healthy by feeding it good nutrition. And there's a direct link between our mental health and nutrition. So when we are looking at treatment options, we want to make sure we're doing those basic things around exercise and nutrition. Mind, body, spirit approaches, such as our faith communities, prayer, and fellowship, all of those are important. There's literally scientific evidence, although I know Black and Brown folks already know this. There is scientific evidence that when we have a connection with a power greater than ourselves, and that's whether you say God or Jesus or Allah, build a relationship with something greater than yourself. That in and of itself is one of the greatest treatment options we have, is to be on the supernatural plane and build something with a higher power. Medication is directed by a licensed practitioner. I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with mental health medications. I totally get that. And there's very legitimate reasons for that fear and concern. Again, I encourage you to be educated around how you can use medications for your mental health. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications do not have to be lifelong behaviors. Those can be short-term strategies while you build those life coping skills. And at the end, I'm going to give you some resources, and I'll make sure that you guys each get copies of this that will show you where you can learn information around counseling, around medication, and a lot of the holistic strategies. So when you begin to realize what trauma looks like, you can begin to advocate by first understanding what it is, and then by looking at the treatment options that you have. Now, I recognize that there's a whole host of barriers around treatment options. There's insurance issues, there's finance issues, there's travel issues. But I also know that Trenton Housing Authority has a lot of resources and supports for its community members to make sure that you get the services that you need. This is where self-advocacy becomes really important, because the squeaky wheel gets the oil. You have to make sure your voice is heard when you know that you or someone you love is struggling, so that you can get plugged into those resources. I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be in crisis. And I think that this is really, really important, because often we find ourselves or our loved ones in crisis and we're not really sure what to do. I want to acknowledge that our mental health system is not perfect. In fact, parts of it are downright broken. But we need to use the resources that we have when we need them. So if you or a family member are dealing with psychosis in any way, psychosis means like having delusional thoughts, feeling like you're detached from reality, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't really there. If you're dealing with psychosis, if you have a family member who is extremely depressed, if you have a family member, God forbid, who's talking suicide, if you have a family member who's deep in substance use disorder, if you have a family member who's become agitated or aggressive because of their mental health, it's okay to ask for help. And so we have crisis units in Mercer County that will support that. And again, I recognize fears around reaching out to institutions, but I've been working really closely with a lot of these institutions for years. And I believe, again, when we empower our community members with self-advocacy skills, then when you engage with these institutions, you know the questions to ask. And you know how to speak up when you feel like you're not getting the services that you need. So when you have someone who's in crisis, Capitol Health Medical Center and Catholic Charities both have crisis units. Also, there's a mobile crisis unit. You can call any one of these numbers. And again, I'll make sure you have these resources if you don't already have them. And a mobile crisis unit will actually come to you if you're in crisis. I think that we want to normalize getting the help when we need it, so that we don't find ourselves in the criminal justice system. So we don't find ourselves homeless. So we don't find ourselves caught up in violence or, God forbid, death. And when we find ourselves in substance use disorder, right? There are ways to enter into recovery, to advocate for ourselves and our loved ones before we get to the crisis, right? If we have youth that are struggling with a mental illness, again, probably born out of a trauma, there is a youth stabilization center. Again, it's a mobile response that you can call 24 hours a day, and they will make sure that this child, and when we say youth, we are talking about children, right, gets the services that they need. I have had more than one parent call me all hours of the day and night to tell me they have a child who is deep in substance use, to tell me they have a child who's talking about suicide, to tell me they have a child who might be delusional or in psychosis, to tell me they have a child who is talking about performing a violent act, right? And it's important to remember that we're talking about children. We're not talking about little adults. And when children are behaving that way, it's usually because they have suffered some form of abuse or trauma. And so we want to intervene as quickly as we can and get them the help that they need. I want to talk about calling 911 for very obvious reasons. We've watched the news and we know that often Black and brown people end up dying when you call 911. I want to be very transparent and direct about that. I recognize that. So I think it's important for you to understand that your safety is always number one, and the safety of your loved ones is always number one. So if you need to call 911 because of somebody who's dealing with a mental health crisis, who may have become aggressive or violent, you need to call, but you need to be very specific about what you say. You need to be very clear in telling them, I need help for a family member who is having a mental health crisis. We need a crisis unit. And I'm going to tell you that for two reasons. One, because law enforcement is taught to do what they do, enforce the law. They're not taught to be mental health experts. So when you call, you are letting them know exactly the situation that they're going to be walking into. And number two, when you call, that's a recorded line. So you are making it clear that this is a mental health crisis. Our law enforcement is getting a lot better about partnering with our mental health experts. So usually, if you let them know it's a mental health crisis, they will reach out to the mobile unit and they will have the mobile unit meet them there at the home. You want to make sure that you are making clear what the situation is when you call 911. I know of instances where people have put themselves in harm's way because they're more fearful about calling 911 than they are about what's going on in their homes. And I totally legitimately understand that righteous fear. But we have to start normalizing what a mental health crisis is and making our systems work for us. Just about everybody has a smartphone. And there's a lot of really great apps on smartphones now that teach you how to build real strong stress management techniques, life coping skills, mental health and emotional wellness techniques that you can do in the privacy of your own home on your smartphone. You can start building really healthy behaviors. Simple habit meditation is one, mood path is another, Pacifica is one, Stigma is one, Calm is another really great one. There's an app called Liberate that is specifically for Black and brown folks that teaches about meditation and mindfulness. These are apps that you can download. A lot of them are free right onto your smartphone to help you start building healthy coping skills. Often we don't have the coping skills that we need because we didn't see people model those coping skills and they didn't teach us those coping skills, not because anything's wrong with us, but we can't know what we don't know, right? I don't know what's going on underneath the hood of my car because I've never been taught that. And quite frankly, I've never been interested, right? It's the same thing with our mental health. If we haven't seen it modeled and if no one normalized speaking on behalf of ourselves and our loved ones when there's a trauma, then we often don't know what to do. I want to talk about suicide. And I know this is a heavy topic, but we as Black and brown folks have to have this conversation. We have to talk about the fact that we are losing our children to suicide. We're losing our parents to suicide. We're losing our grandparents to suicide. We're losing our grandchildren to suicide. It's important to know the warning signs. If you have a smartphone, a Chromebook, or a laptop, or access to any of those things, you need to download this meme for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and keep it somewhere where you can get to it. The suicidepreventionlifeline.org is an awesome organization, not only if you are feeling suicidal or a loved one is feeling suicidal, but even if you're just feeling hopeless or helpless or confused and not sure where to turn. When you call this national number, they will direct you anywhere in the country to your local suicide line. And you will get a live person who will actually talk to you for however long you need them to talk to you. And they will provide you with resources to disrupt that thought about ending your life. So it's important to understand that most people become suicidal when they feel helpless and hopeless. And often if you're a victim of trauma or ongoing big T, little t traumas, because in our communities, it's often not just one event, but a sequence of events that knock us down like a row of dominoes, right? And we get to the point where we are feeling suicidal. And in Black and brown communities, we don't say suicidal, we say, I'm tired. We say, I don't want to do this anymore. When we start to feel helpless and hopeless, we start doing things like talking about wanting to die or looking for a way to kill ourselves or searching for information online, where to buy a gun or how to get pills, right? We start talking about feeling hopeless and having no reason to live. The world would be better off without me. Well, doesn't anybody care anyway? Talking about feeling trapped or talking about being in pain and hurting or talking about being a burden to others. When you hear this language, when you see this language on social media, when people begin to display these behaviors, that's concern that people are seriously thinking about suicide. I wish in 1978 that someone had seen the signs that my mother was thinking about suicide, but we didn't know enough about suicide back then. We definitely didn't know enough about bipolar disorder back then, which I believe my mother had. And we ended up losing her on a summer day when nobody saw it coming. And so she has six beautiful grandchildren and more than a dozen great-grandchildren that she never had a chance to see. I think it's important that we understand that Black and brown folks do die by suicide and they don't have to, that we do have resources and that we can disrupt that. We can disrupt that process. These are mental health resources. So anytime I teach on mental health, these are the resources that I use. Many of these organizations I've gone through training and gotten certifications. And when I share the resource list, this will be on it. And again, in the privacy of your own home, you can use your smartphone, your laptop, your Chromebook, your desktop, or you can go to the library and you can do your homework so that you begin to understand what trauma is, what mental illness is, what depression looks like, what anxiety looks like, what post-traumatic stress disorder looks like, so that you can advocate for yourself and your loved ones. So you have the language to bring your voice into the room when there's a problem. What I want to do now is come back into the virtual room and I'm going to talk a little bit about what resiliency looks like. And as I said, I'll stay in the room as long as you will have me because I want to make sure that I can answer any questions that you have. Thank you, Brother Ward, for saying that you know my pain. I appreciate that affirmation and validation. So let me talk a little bit about resilience. I think, again, as a people, as Black people, as brown people, as poor people, we are resilient creatures, right? But I think what happens often is that we have not been taught what I call proactive resilience, right? Resilience that we actively work to build and practice on a regular basis, right? Active resilience or proactive resilience means learning self-confidence, learning adaptability, learning positive social engagement skills. That's active resilience, right? Resilience means making your self-care and your wellness number one, your number one priority. It means unabashedly, unapologetically saying, if I'm not healthy, I can't serve myself or my family or my community. That's resilience. And resilience and strength are two different things. We are often a strong people. When we get knocked down, we get back up. But mules are strong too. And what happens often is that we deal with trauma and stress and pain and abuse and adversity, and then we die young from preventable diseases and from addictions and substance use disorders. The difference between strength and resilience is with resilience, you learn from when you get knocked down so that you can have skills to prevent you from getting knocked down again. So that when crisis and adversity comes along, which it will, you will learn how to advocate for yourself and your loved one and find the resources that you need. That's resilience. And when we build resilience and we model those behaviors, we teach our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren what resilience looks like. We all know how to be in the struggle, and we all know how to hustle to make ends meet, because I know what it feels like to be a single parent trying to figure out how I was going to feed my kids. We know how to do that. That's not resilience. Resilience is building coping skills and life skills and stress management skills so that we don't have to be in the struggle, because we deserve all things good, and being in the struggle is not a good thing. Being on the grind is not a good thing. So a large part of resiliency, and I teach whole classes on resilience, is building your self-care strategies for your physical wellness, your mental and emotional wellness, your spiritual wellness, and your financial wellness. And financial wellness does not mean that you have to be rich. Financial wellness means that you are capable of providing for yourself and your loved ones so that finances are not a stress factor for you. And I totally get that that is not an easy thing to do. But one of the things that resilience will teach you is where to find the resources to empower yourself and your loved ones. I get that there are systems and infrastructures and barriers that were designed to oppress and marginalize whole communities. I am not naive, but I also know that part of resilience and empowerment is learning how to dismantle that so that you and your family and your communities are empowered. So that's the difference between resilience and strength. We all have strength, or we wouldn't be sitting here today. But resilience is learning how not to get knocked down and how to build strategies so that you're empowered and your loved ones are empowered, because the traumas are there. If you're born Black and brown in this country, you are going to live through traumas every single day. How do you build up the resiliency to keep standing? And how do you teach your children and grandchildren to keep standing? And how do you embrace joy and happiness? And how do you live out your purpose? And how do you pursue goals and objectives? And how do you embrace your dreams? You do that by building resiliency and making sure that your mental health and wellness is your number one priority. And I'm giving you permission to make it your number one priority. And anybody who's gaslighting you and telling you that your wellness is not the priority is not the person that you want in your circle. Because you're no good to anybody. I'm no good to anybody if I don't make my wellness a priority, if you don't make your wellness a priority, right? And don't use me as the yardstick. standing in front of people and teaching and preaching and facilitating and speaking, that's my gift. That's what I do, right? Your wellness does not mean that you have to stand in front of people and speak on it like I do. Your wellness depends on what's important to you and how you are thriving in life, how you show up in life, how you serve in your purpose in life. Your financial success is what's important to you and your family. So make that a number one priority. And I teach whole classes on what self-care and resiliency looks like. Those are usually 2 and 3 hour classes. And I'm sorry that we're still in the midst of a pandemic and I can't be in the room because I would hug each and every one of you. Darren Freedom Green knows that because he's been in many of my classes, right? But I want you to understand that recognizing your own resilience in the face of trauma, in the face of adversity, means that you have found a way to be empowered. You have found a way to self-advocate. And you deserve that because you deserve all things good. In spite of the fact that society has socialized us to believe that we don't, we do indeed deserve all things good. And no one is but knocking down our door to tell us that. So we have to make sure that we're building our own empowerment and building our own self-advocacy. And so we are teaching our children and grandchildren something different, right? Because my parents loved me and they did everything they could with what they knew and with what they had, but they modeled behaviors that taught me what trauma looks like. And I followed in those footsteps because nobody modeled empowerment for them. Nobody modeled self-advocacy for them. So they loved me and did everything they could and gave me everything they had. And now that I know better, I have to do better for my children and grandchildren. And I encourage you to do the same for yourself and your loved ones and your community. And with that, I want to open the floor to any questions that you have. And I want you to feel comfortable asking questions. There are no stupid questions. There's nothing you could ask me that would surprise me or offend me. And so I want you to be comfortable sharing your thoughts, asking me questions, pushing back if there's something that you disagree on. Let's have a discussion. And I will let my moderators lead how you want to handle the questions.
Christy, we can't hear you.
How about now?
You hear?
Can you hear us now?
Yes.
So the question was, how do you deal with police violence because it's really impacting her?
Yes, how do you deal with police violence? So that in and of itself is a pandemic in this country, right? And we cannot anymore, moving forward as a country, we can no longer pretend that we don't know this. We can no longer pretend that police brutality is not a part of everyday life for Black and brown folks, right? And so many of us have been traumatized with either direct engagement with law enforcement or indirect engagement with law enforcement, meaning we witnessed something or we have a loved one that may have suffered a trauma with law enforcement engagement, right? So I'm going to tell you two things. The first thing is make sure you're taking care of yourself. If you're dealing with the trauma, any trauma, but especially if you're dealing with trauma around police brutality or engagement with law enforcement, you want to go and get the help that you need for that trauma. That's the first thing, because you're not going to be able to advocate for yourself strong if you are actually struggling with your own peace of mind. And it's very normal that you would be struggling if you have had a negative engagement with law enforcement, or you have directly or indirectly engaged with police brutality. Okay, so that's the first thing, is go and get the help that you need. Do not make the mistake of saying, I'm strong, I can handle this. You weren't built to handle it. None of us were built to deal with brutality and violence and oppression and marginalization. We were not created. I do not believe for 1 minute that the Creator created us to have to deal with that. So don't think that if you go and seek help that it means you're weak or something's wrong with you. It means something has happened to you. So the first thing you have to do is go get the help that you need. As you begin to heal and you build up your physical and emotional bandwidth, and you begin to grow those self-advocacy skills, one of the most empowering things you can do is align yourself with an organization that's doing the work. When you align yourself with organizations that are doing the work to make change, we empower ourselves and our communities. But you can't do that before you first deal with your own personal trauma, right? I can't come to you broken from my mother's suicide and my alcoholism and all the other traumas that I experienced. I can't stand here in front of you and teach you advocacy and wellness, and I haven't handled my stuff. So the Kimmy Carls that you're looking at has spent more than 20 years in individual therapy, group therapy, and I've done a lot of work around dealing with my own traumas, dealing with my own recovery, before I even had the opportunity to stand in front of somebody and say, this is what recovery looks like. So that's your number one step, is to start working on your own wellness. Heal, begin to heal, because you deserve all things good. And once you begin to heal, then align yourself with organizations that are doing the work, like the Trenton NAACP, the new Jim Crow of Trenton, Not in Our Town in Princeton, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. These are all organizations that are doing the work around systemic racism and systemic injustices, one of which obviously is police brutality. But first, you're going to focus on your wellness so that you are resilient enough and powerful enough to come to the table and make change.
Kimmy, I believe Algernon has a question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am. As we speak, our city is beginning to grapple with the question of legalized marijuana and what rules are going to apply. We're all glad to see that this long sought change in the law has happened, but at the same time, we can't blind ourselves to the fact that our community is intoxicated, not just from marijuana, from all of the other drugs and alcohol that find their way to predominate in our community. So as we think about what we need to do to legalize, how to handle the legalization of marijuana, I think it's instructive to remind people that marijuana is also an addictive drug, and that what we need to have in place ahead of time before, as far as legalization is concerned, before it becomes a problem, let's get in ahead of it. What would you advise in the realm of what to watch out for, even when it becomes legal?
Right, I agree. So I'm going to be very honest with you. I have very mixed feelings about marijuana being legalized. I grieve and am righteously angry for all of our Black, brown men and women who were in prison for very minor offenses around marijuana. And at the same time, I also grieve for all of our men, women, and children who started with marijuana and moved into heavier substance use disorders. I want to say that we have whole communities that are self-medicating, right? I mean, that's what alcoholism is. That's what it was for me, right? And everybody who's using crack cocaine, everybody who's using heroin, everybody who's smoking a joint are self-medicating. I can guarantee you that. there is such a thing as recreational drugs. But for those of us who live through traumas every day, often those substances are a way of escaping, because when you don't have healthy ways to deal with the trauma, when you don't have resources and infrastructures that support wellness and recovery, then you are going to find a way to medicate that pain. And in our poor urban communities, drugs are readily available. And that includes marijuana. So I think that we have to simultaneously look at the injustices in our country, which is a whole different presentation, and how those affect our Black, brown, poor communities. And we need to also teach our families and our communities what substance use disorder looks like, right? Because it's going to end up being the same thing alcohol is. Alcohol is legal, which is why I was able to drink and live in a state of drunkenness for more than 2 decades, because I was what you call a functioning alcoholic. I got married, I had kids, I had a job, I bought a house, I maintained a career, and there was whole days where I wasn't sober. But nobody said anything to me because liquor is legal. So when I strolled up in a liquor store, nobody said, no, Kimmy, you can't buy this. In fact, I was walking in the liquor stores when I was 14, because in the 9th grade, I was 5'11". Nobody questioned me because liquor is legal and it's acceptable. We've been socialized to think that liquor is okay. We've been socialized to think that wine is okay. What do we do when we celebrate? We go out drinking, right? And I tell people all the time that if alcohol had been illegal, like crack cocaine and heroin, I would have been in an abandoned building somewhere. That's the only difference between me and somebody addicted to crack cocaine. The only difference. So we have to teach substance use disorder and recovery around marijuana the same way we teach it around alcoholism and crack cocaine and heroin. We have to understand the difference between using recreational drugs and what addiction looks like. Because some of us can have a glass of wine for a certain celebration or have a couple of beers when we're watching the Super Bowl, and then we're fine. But addicts can't do that. If I have a glass of wine for a celebration, I'm going to be back to drinking a bottle a night. And then when I get tired of that, I'm going to be drinking rum and then Hennessy and a whole host of other heavy liquors, right? So I think we have to do the same thing with marijuana that we do with alcohol and any other drug. There has to be education around what addiction looks like and how you manage that. And we as a community have to be willing to advocate for ourselves and our loved ones and normalize the conversation. Oh, that's the uncle that's always drunk in the family. That's not funny. Even though we like to make fun of it, it's not funny. Oh, that's the crackhead in the family. That's not funny. That's an illness. And we need to normalize having conversation around it the same way we normalize having conversations for congestive heart failure and diabetes. I hope that answers your question, sir.
It does, Kimmy, thank you. And that
Very
was what I was thinking. And so we'll design ordinances to have that in mind. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So
Christy, we can't hear very well.
So the question was, Kimmy, in regards to marijuana legalization issue, if we know that it's probably going to be problematic in some areas, like Algernon was talking about, why isn't those problems being discussed as well so that we can be educated as a collective community?
I agree. So in other words, why aren't we discussing a lot of the injustices that lead to substance use disorders? Is that the question?
well, hold on, and not only that, I think her biggest question is, if we know that there will be issues or could be issues with the marijuana dispensaries in the city, why is that? Why is it a hot topic with the city on their with their planning? Because right now, I believe this is something that the city is discussing.
Mhm. I don't want to get too deep into politics, but let me say this, because again, we're going in a different direction from trauma. But let me say this. Every oppressive and marginalized infrastructure is born out of capitalism, and capitalism was born out of structural racism. So what that means is, if we can build a process that's going to make us money, then we're going to make it legal, and we're not concerned with the communities that it might decimate. And so we as a community need to look at how we can actively advocate for the systemic injustices that are going to be born out of people making money on the backs of Black humanity after Black humanity was incarcerated for decades for the same thing. And that's very different from the conversation we're having today. But it's important to recognize that we all know the direction that this is going in. And we all know the communities that will be hurt the hardest unless we collaborate and begin to build a strong enough advocacy to make sure that our voices are heard when decisions are made. Because quite frankly, the people with the power and the money are not interested in those that will suffer the most. And I understand that what I just said was controversial, and I'm sticking by it.
Do we have any more questions? Are there any other questions? Okay, drug dispensaries need to finance the drug education and treatment for weed addiction if they are, I didn't read the rest of it.
Yep, I read that. That's definitely one strategy. And I think that there's a whole host of other strategies out there. I think that drug awareness and drug education starts early. We need to be talking about this in the 3rd grade, because we know that those who build prisons are already planning on how they're going to fill those prisons based on 3rd graders' grades and test scores. So we need to start teaching our children then what substance use disorder looks like, what legal and illegal and illicit drugs are, and how to make sure that they are advocating for themselves before we get to the drug dispensaries who need to pay for drug education.
Do you have any other questions?
Michael, I see you're not driving anymore.
I am not. I am home, and I actually did have a question, if I may. You've talked a lot about how individuals should really think about trauma and address trauma. Could you speak a little bit to what you've seen, sort of what type of collective trauma processing and working through experiences you've seen? Because I think that that's a lot of what is often unspoken as well, in addition to not recognizing individual trauma in different ways, but also it's really hard to think about and conceptualize what a collective working through of collective trauma would look like.
Right, right. So whole communities are traumatized, right, on a daily basis. So let me give you an example of another situation that really just grieved me. You know, so a couple years ago, we had a mass shooting at Art All Night. Remember that? And, you know, Art All Night, people come from as far as Philadelphia, Delaware, New York to come to Art All Night at Trenton, right? Not to mention Princeton and Hopewell and a whole host of other places across the state. People have a lot of respect for Trenton's Art All Night event. And when we had that shooting, there was a lot of talk about how the community was traumatized, right? But what was important and that nobody acknowledged is that a lot of the participants in that event are gonna go back to the communities where they have resources for their trauma. And the residents in Trenton do not. And we were left as Trenton residents to process that trauma on our own while the rest of the country said, there, see, those Black people in Trenton, this is what they do all the time. And when we see mass shootings in other states and counties and cities and towns, that's not the response. You see people coalescing around those communities and uplifting those communities and supporting those communities, and that didn't happen in Trenton. So that's a perfect example of a collective trauma. Every time someone is murdered by gunfire, and that's whether it's from a police officer or from a community member, right? That is a collective trauma in the community. I remember some years ago, I want to say 2013, at the time I was a member of Galilee Baptist Church, and I remember in the midst of a funeral, there was a drive-by shooting and they shot out the stained glass windows in the church. That is a collective trauma. The entire church was traumatized. The entire neighborhood was traumatized, okay? So I'm giving these examples to Michael's point, just so you understand what collective trauma looks like. So when you have gang warfare going on and people's children are being slaughtered in the streets like animals, those are collective traumas, okay? And just like you have collective community traumas, you can also have collective community healing events. And we see this in Trenton all the time, right? Things like health and healing music events, the Serenity Garden, trainings like this. These are ways that we begin to help heal the traumas in the community, but we have to normalize that as opposed to it being the exception, right? The Serenity Garden over there on West State Street should not be an exception. It should be the norm. We should have Serenity Gardens in every single part of the city, right? And we should be normalizing events where we bring community together to discuss the traumas and create healing behaviors. But because we often don't recognize what trauma is, and because there's legitimate righteous fear around discussing traumas, then often we don't have collecting healing going on. When someone is murdered or a large, powerful figure, giant in the community dies, then we have an event and then everybody goes back to dealing with their individual traumas, right? I think that we, to Michael's point, can come together and have these events on a normal basis. We have small events that are happening here and there by diehard, steadfast giants in the community who are doing this work, but we don't normalize it the way we normalize it in other communities. And I think that that is a strategy that we could definitely begin to build and work on.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's also difficult to address collective traumas when they're so enmeshed with all the other systems that you've been talking about too, in terms of multi-generational racial capitalism, as you said. So yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Any other questions for Ms. Carlos before we close out for tonight? Nothing.
Well, I hope this blessed you. Thank you so much for being in the room, being interested in having this conversation. I am not difficult to find, so please, if you have questions later on, if you want more resources, if you're interested in having me come in the room and have further discussion, I'm very happy to do that. My calling is to empower as many people as possible, and I aim to do that. So I'm delighted to be here. I pray that you have a blessed spring, and please continue to keep yourself safe, because we are still in the midst of a pandemic.
And can we have the materials where you be able to share them so that I can for the residents?
I can't, if you're talking to me, I can't hear you.
Materials that you, your presentation and information, would you be able to share that so that I can pass them out to the residents here and email them around to the group?
Yes, I think I heard you're asking for resources.
Yes.
Yep, I have a great resource list. It's in the form of a PDF. I will send that over to Michael, since he was my contact. And yes, feel free to share it far and wide in the community.
Okay, it was also requested the list of Black and Brown counselors that you had shared. Would you be able to share that as well?
Yep, happy to share that also.
Anyone else have any questions? Okay, and we did introductions earlier, but we do have one of our board of commissioners online, Sherry Garrett. So we'd like to acknowledge that she's participating in tonight's series. Thank you, Ms. Garrett. And,
thank you for having me.
And you want to close that for you? Okay, so we're good. And thank you so much, Ms. Carlos, since this was a wonderful presentation. We're gonna have Freedom close out for us.
So can everyone hear me? Okay, so although we're virtual, can we all put our hands like this together and give Kimmy Carlos and the mission?
Put those up.
We adore you, and I thank you. You are one of our greatest blessings. But my first point is, with all these people on the screen, right? And Kimmy pointed to it. You mean to tell me nobody has questions? You have them, but you feel ashamed to ask them. And I'll say it for you. We've got to move beyond that. This is an integral part of why our families, why our communities, and why our city oftentimes fails. Not because we aren't qualified or we have the capacity. It's simply because we won't say that we're hurting. We won't ask the questions that we need to know. And the worst question you can have is the one you hold on to, because you come into the room and then you leave out probably in a worse condition than when you came in. All right, you've got to move past that shit. There's not knowing. And again, people come who have the information you need to ask those questions. Why? They can arm you so that you leave out with the mental, physical, and psychological armor to deal with the war that's going on outside. How do I know we have questions? Well, last year, amongst the 40 murders that's not being talked about, one of them was a young lady who got killed right outside the dollar store. Who remembers that? Right?
No, I don't remember that.
Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
I have a question, because if we, as tenants, me personally, I feel that we keep addressing certain things, we come off as maybe, well, they the troublemaker, whatever, which I just started. But my thing is trauma. If you are really dealing with trauma, or you overcame trauma, and then you have been around massive shootings in the city since I've been here, and the weather's starting to get warm now. I come home today from a meeting from Housing Authority, and it's riffraff all in my building. I come online, I need to unwind for a few minutes because I got to get online at 5 o'clock to start the next meeting online. And on both sides of my windows, it's just riffraff. The noise is so unbearable to I can't even concentrate. It's just making me stressed out. I'm already a hostage in my home. This is where I live. I'm a hostage in my home. And it seemed to me like nobody at Housing Authority understands that. We are hostages, or my neighbors are hostages. We are texting each other. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. 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 Can you watch out for, okay. Yeah. Okay. No one understands it. Everyone wants us to just look at the roses. But to get to the end of the tunnel, and majority of us here, or majority of the women here, are maybe single mothers or single women. Me, myself, I'm just a single woman. I don't have children. And it may be a little bit easier down the road for me to pick up and leave, because I can't take but so much. Everything that I have, I worked for it. No one gave it to me. When I come in, I clean up behind myself. I clean up for other people that had their health and strength. And it seemed to be like, they're doing just what you said. They are killing their pain by drugs and alcohol all day long. I'm in the primary example, we're in the middle of the allergy season. I come in, I got my mask on, I got existing health problems. I take my whole place is filled up with marijuana and cigarette smokes. Cigarette just set me off. So now, is that not trauma? I have been through enough. In 2001, I beat my trauma. I beat my health trauma.
Yeah,
And
I hear your pain, sister. And I know that what you are speaking to.
We don't need
Let me affirm.
With this, we had prayer. I seen Jersey on TV many a days. And when I lived in Philadelphia, the heart of Philadelphia. And I've seen more. I was born and raised in New Jersey. I seen the violence in both states, but I didn't live amongst the violence in Philadelphia. But I can maneuver anywhere. I came from poverty. I can maneuver anywhere. I'm not a scary person, but this is just not a good night for me. Because to get online and act like everything is good and everything is, I can hear myself think, no, it's not that way here. Just everybody gets in their car and they go home. But when I go to bed, I have to say extra prayer, because that car I pay, I'm still paying for it. So when I get up in the morning, I don't know if it's stolen or someone hits it, breaks the window. These are the things that they cover up. We are human beings we are living in a war zone. They can't tell me this is not a war zone. My brothers served in Afghanistan, Desert Storm. I have friends that serve. They come here and visit. And tell me to just be happy. Tonight is not a good night. And I'm a very cool, laid back person. I'm older, I'm wiser now. But how much more? Because if I move tomorrow, I have an 80-year-old mother here that doesn't want to leave this trauma. I can pack up and go back to Philadelphia. And it seemed like I'd rather go home to stay in this. This is ridiculous. What do you pay security for? We are the people that's suffering. We are suffering. If we get killed, they'll say, oh, yeah, I don't really know. I'm so sorry they died. They got killed. I got 2 weeks, 3 weeks less. I have to be in my college classes. How can I concentrate with all this noise? How? I don't want
everything you're saying is valid, sis. I feel your pain. You have leadership in this virtual room that need to be addressing what you are dealing with. Is this trauma? Yes, it is. Is this dealing with your mental health? Yes, it is. Is it dealing with your physical health? Yes, it is. Do we live in a war zone in Trenton? Yes, we do. Just like we live in a war zone in Chicago and in the Bronx, New York, and in Camden and Elizabeth and Watts, where I grew up. You're absolutely right. I want to affirm that, which is exactly why we're having this conversation, to acknowledge the fact that we are dealing with traumas on a regular basis. And there's barriers and infrastructures and systems and frameworks that make it difficult to dismantle that, but it doesn't mean that it can't be done. So I want to acknowledge and affirm your pain, let you know that it is absolutely valid. And I hope the folks that have the power in this room hear what Annette is telling you.
I want to thank you, Kimmy.
May I speak? I agree with you, Kimmy. The young lady, what is her name? What is the
Annette.
tenant's name?
Annette.
What was it? Annette. Annette,
Yes.
I understand. I hear you. I've lived not in the community you lived in, but I've lived in an area where I moved into I'm older person, in a flat that when I moved there, it's a beautiful place. It was remodeled. And the neighborhood, I didn't see any kids. And they tell you don't move in a place until you actually sit outside and see what's going on in the community. But nor here or there. I moved in and I had the same situation. And the lesson, everything is a learning, is a teachable moment. And my teachable moment in moving in that neighborhood and whatnot was, I moved on a corner, and the corner was used for whatever, activity. It took me 2 years, but what I want to share with you is that, first of all, just take deep breaths. I understand, and I've been there, and I had to really go out and, speak with them. I didn't talk, and I'm saying I'm telling you my experience. I had to actually talk with them and say, listen, could you, and I live near a park. I said, could you take your activity in front of your door or take it to the park? This is where I live. Your lifestyle and my lifestyle do not agree. And I don't want to be a casualty with the type of, activity that, you perform. They looked at me at first, but they moved. It was challenging for, like I said, a couple of years. For first year, I pull up and they would move, they would scatter. And then I had to stop and I said, please, I shouldn't have to pull up in front of my door and, and you'd scatter. Please don't stand in front of my door when I'm home or not home. I'm asking this of you. They didn't, say anything negative. It's just your approach. It's just how you, because I've heard people say, even relatives, you got to watch what you say to these people. These people, they'll turn around, they'll do X.
I'm gonna kill you.
Everybody wants to have a conversation. They just want you to talk to them like you want to be talked to. So
I talk to them in a nice way. I tell them, I said, listen, I'm not well, or I'm tired, or, you can't be in front of the door. You can't shoot dice and sell drugs. You just can't do it. You know what? When I wake up, they burnt the whole door. I called the police. A police officer, I think it was the highway patrol, came in here. He looked at me. He said, you know what? You lucky they didn't kill you.
Right. And the police would tell me the same thing. They say, don't talk to them. But you know what? After being there, living there for a while, I was called to safe haven. They stopped standing in front of my door. If they had issues in the neighborhood, they would stand in front of my door because they know if it got out of hand, or I would say to them, listen, this is not how to handle this. I'd like you to move from my door. But they knew, and the cops used to say, well, don't tell them that you're going to call the cops. I said, no. I don't want retaliation. My thing is, if you continue doing what you're going to do, trust me, I'm going to call the police. Of course, like kids, they tried it. I will call the police. And if the police came with a negative behavior, I made sure I reached out to city council. I reached out to the mayor. I reached out to the director of police. You have to form relationships. my point of speaking out like this is it's relationships. It's getting to know the executive director, it's getting to at the housing authority, getting to know Darren Green, coming together with the
No,
police
no, no, no,
director.
no, 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 no.
Coming together with the police director, or having the
I have a-
council or the mayor come there and speak with people. We have to have a dialogue. And the administration there at the housing authority, they can't do it by themselves. It's got to be a whole community, people in various levels within the city coming there collectively and making a stance. So I'm sorry that you have to go through that. You should not have to go through that, but it's everything is like I said, a learning. It's a learning experience how to deal in whatever situation. Once I kind of figured out how to work in that environment, it got better. It was a struggle for 2 or 3 years, and I had the same issues.
Commissioner Garrett,
I'll stop talking.
Can I just interject for a second? Annette,
Sure.
this is Jelani Garrett, Executive Director. I want to know,
Yes.
I want you to know that, I 100% hear you. I feel your pain. And quite honestly, we have not been successful in getting control of this situation yet. I mean, we put in some things, hopefully this summer. We hired a new director of security. We doing some things to limit the traffic coming into here, but we've looked at this and we've seen this happen over the last couple of summers, and working together, we really have not been successful in basically getting control of this situation. And I acknowledge what you're saying, and what you're saying is real. It hurts my heart, and it is. I mean, I understand what the commissioner is saying. It is public safety and the housing authority working together, but we have to do a better job to lock this place down. Like I said, hopefully when we get this gate out front where everybody only vehicle traffic will be residents, we're actually putting also on the other gates is going to be a only residential traffic to come into the place, unless your guests, you'll have to call in. And we're actually doing a trespassing policy with our board. So this summer we want this situation to be rectified. But I just wanted to say that I acknowledge everything you're saying. And, I'm not going to point the blame and say, oh, it's the police, it's this one. It's all of the agencies should be working together to make sure that you have a safe and you can enjoy the quiet enjoyment of your home.
Exactly.
This what's going on right now. I guess somebody was killed last year, so they gathering over there to, celebrate the person or that was killed last year, letting off balloons, and there's a fight. So I just want to say that, nobody's sugarcoating it. Nobody's trying to say that everything's good. We know we have challenges, but I just want to tell you that definitely not on deaf ears, and we are working to rectify this situation.
That is actually true. That Annette, that he is correct. That he is actually trying to rectify that, and he is working on it diligently. From our meeting, that's what's the plan. There's a plan, and as he just expressed it, that is his plan, and we support him.
I understand.
But my thing is just I agree with you, but it's just getting some alliances, and I'm sorry to hear that. And just take a deep breath.
I talk to my neighbors, respect me. My neighbors know that I'm the only one cleans the building, sweep the hall, mop the hall, get up the trash, all of that. So when it just overwhelmed me. From yesterday, they was just going back and forth. I even went to the store. I talked to when they opened that store up back there, I talked to the owner very politely. We talked. I told him, we're in a community. We want better for our community. He was fine. It was the gentleman that worked in the store that was a Black man that wanted to attack me, that said he lives in Downey Homes. I just backed away, got in my car, left. No problem. The majority of the people they respect me enough. They know that they don't come into the building. The young lady that lives upstairs said that she tells them, listen, you can't do that in the building here. They respect me, I respect them. They speak, I keep going. It seemed like, because I can't tell who live here, who don't live here. I'm a person, I don't interact, I don't sit out, I don't do all of that. That's just not for me. It's just that, it's just so much. You come home, people are double park, and we're the police, and if we double park in a complex, you can't double park in the middle of the street and be shooting dice and get all of this riffraff, and then you stuck in between here because you're thinking about, this is low income, so all my bills is counted for. I'm thinking, like, if somebody hit my car, my premium going up. I'm just trying to get home. I just want to get home. It's not that I'm driving on 95 trying to get home. I'm in the middle of my complex trying to get home to just get in my parking space and just go in my house. That's all I agree.
It's very stressful.
So
when you
it's
beat
fine.
and say something, then they attack you. I completely agree with her.
That's right. They attack you. If you say something, you attack, especially a woman. You're a mark. You're just marked. It's okay for a guy to say, hey, this, because men has a tendency, they approach each other in a different way because he can't say what he wants to say to another man. But when it comes to a woman, it's different. Right. And that's what I want the understanding is, it's different. I didn't grow up to be weak. I grew up with 6 brothers. I'm the youngest of 8 children. Majority of these people know me and I don't remember them, but they knew me as a child growing up, and they respected my family because they knew how my parents raised us. But it's just, the day was just from yesterday to today. It was just, I wasn't even like this. I was kind of like on a little edge when I went to see Charisse. And then when I came home and all of this, I just was like, it's just, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was just.
It's too much. No, we glad, we keep it, we're glad to hear from you. We need to hear that.
I just, and I one time I paused and I almost got up and went to the door and said, please. But then I'm like, then that interrupt my spirit.
Right.
I just want peace.
Right. We got you.
We got enough going on in the world. So that's all I have to say. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Miss Beth.
Thank you.
Who? Okay. What is it? Team? Okay. And again, we want to acknowledge, we're going to be back again next week, next Wednesday. It'll be team building. Okay. And Mrs. Annette Payne is all about pain. And part of it, yeah, because, if we see her and her expression, and we're not moved by that, something's wrong with us. So we ought to feel where she's at. And as the executive director said, he went into it a little bit last week, we are being intentional about saying stuff that other people won't say. We are working, we are putting programmatic issues in place to address our Black and brown males, because that's predominantly where our problems are. We're not sugarcoating this, okay? When we look at our complexes, when we look at our sites, when you look at what's going on, that's who's doing the craziness. That's who's doing the chaos. That's where the disrespectful behavior is coming from. We're trying to intentionally address that by providing workforce development or just engaging them in terms of educational opportunities or working with them to get back in their homes amongst their families. Because when you begin to rebuild families, that's when we're at our best. So she's absolutely right. When it's woman to woman, it's a different conversation. And we've clearly created a culture now where we're comfortable disrespecting our women. That's why the ED, that's why the deputy has laid it out with the leadership team. We have to be intentional about not only going and getting our men, but rebuilding our men. Because when our families are functional, when they're the foundation of what we're doing, we have a much more thriving and constructive community. So we are where you are. We're not sugarcoating this. This is going across the city. You can see it everywhere. Now, we cannot police our way out of it. We can't lock everybody up. And certainly the police, clearly, when you see them, we're not going to knock them or point fingers at them, but they're not going to be the answer to our solution. We have to address our social issues. We have to address our social constructs. And to Kimmy Carlos's point, which is why we had this information session tonight, we are in a way damaged. How do you know? Yesterday, a young man at 9 o'clock, I'm informing the ED that a car was shot up 18 times right around the corner here, right around one of our properties here. And when I got there, they were taking a young man out of the car to the emergency ward. And to my knowledge, he's in critical condition. Did anybody in any form of authority say anything yesterday? We were on ABC News, whether you know it or not. Did anybody address that situation? Did anybody deal with that situation? No. When I walked around the community checking on the adults, the parents, the babies, guess what people were saying? They were aware of it. They were traumatized by it. But again, you let a cultural context be set in place that kind of behavior is okay. So guess what happens? We normalize insanity, because what happened yesterday was insanity. So again, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm saying as a collective community of people who care and are determined to get to a particular place in time, we've got to keep working at it. And it did not get messed up overnight. So I assure you, it's not going to get right and tight overnight. It will be a consistent, committed effort of not just coming to these meetings, but taking what we talk about in these meetings and going back to our sites, our properties, our homes, and implementing it collectively. It is not one person's responsibility. It is all of our responsibilities. Until we can build a collective mindset of people who are determined to get to where we decide to go, then we'll get there. And again, I'm not blaming anyone, but I'm saying this work that we do has to be all of us working together. And these meetings like this, we want to keep this going. We want to keep bringing Kimmy Carlos in. So a lot of the behaviors that we see eroding the quality of life in our communities, we can begin to identify them and address them, not just by ourselves, but within our own families, within our own communities. So this work is all of ours. This transformation is all of ours, right? And again, you can see in certain projects and sites where we're going, we've gotten better. But to a next point, no, there's nothing cute about this. We aren't in a pretty place, and we have monumental work to do. And that's on all of us. And I feel deeply hurt and pain that she was overwhelmed today, because her pain, the way I see it as a speaker and advocate, it's my pain. And if I don't feel what she feels, then there's something wrong with me. And I want us all to get to a place where we see any of us hurting, all of us are hurting, and we move like that. Because if you ever look at the communities of ours that came up historically, that's when we thrive. And part of our reason is we live in a continuous state of survival, so we've never arrived at a place of thriving. See, we shouldn't just be back to the wall, always struggling. No, we have to work on the social constructs, the unemployment, the underemployment, the mental health, the poverty, all of the social constructs and the constraints that keep us in a continuous state of not having. And if you have large communities of people who feel like they're not going anywhere, not doing anything, not being able to go places, then that becomes a culture of crime and criminal behavior. And it's not everybody, but even if it's one too many. So our work has to be about working on these issues, identifying these issues, working with the consultants, working with the executive director, his vision, his direction, and getting behind it so that we move in small victories to begin to shape and hold the Trenton Housing Authority to be a better place in the world. And that's where we are with this work. We're not here to talk cute. I'm not here to look nice in my suit. I'm here to help us identify issues and then work to have strategic action plans to correct them collectively together. One of our commissioners is here. Why is that important? Well, two of them are. So again, salute to Clifton Anderson. He's one of our commissioners. So again, when you talk about that, those are the board members who shape policy, working with our executive director to make changes here. So we're all concerned and committed about making this happen. But you have to show up to the meetings. And then what I would say to you is keep sharing the information so that this screen becomes filled. And again, if the screen's not filled, what are we talking about? What are we doing? Right? People should be committed to this work if you really want it to become better, because it's not going to happen overnight. And then no one person is assigned to resurrect the whole collective body of Trenton Housing Authority. All of us have to do it. So again, we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. You should be here. 5:30 is the start time. And what are we doing? Team building. But you again can come. You can express what's going on with you. You can talk about the issues that are concerning you. And the more you let us know about what's going on, the more we can work collectively and comprehensively to address those issues. It's not going to get right overnight. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't address it, if we become conditioned to a condition, then it won't move forward. And I'm just saying to you, for too long, we've accepted mediocrity and failure, and that's what we're living in. So if we really are committed to being victorious, it means you're willing to do whatever's necessary to move ourselves as a collective body towards that victory line. And victory for me means to Mrs. Annette coming home and not having craziness in front of her house, not being overwhelmed at night. And she says she's about to start school. She should be able to come home, pop her computer on, and be able to study with peace of mind because the neighbors around her are acting in a civilized behavior. Those are the things I'm looking to have happen, not at one site, but all of our sites. And it's not going to happen with just one person talking about it, but it's all of us doing it. Can we all work towards that goal? Can we all keep moving in that way? Can you see the light coming forward? And I just leave you with the simple word, 1 Peter 4:8. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. And I think one of the greatest sins ever committed is not taking time to let people around you, people by you, people near you, let you know you love them. Tomorrow's not promised. Express yourself in the moments you have. Keep fighting, y'all. We ain't gonna lose this war. We'll win it collectively. All right? Stay encouraged.
That's true. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Good
Thank
night.
you, Annette. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Yes.
I feel for
Yeah.
Well, when we came in,
How do you deal with trauma when it's trauma at your door every day?
when we came in, the bus driver that brought us here, he said this is like this every night. I'm like,